Okay, for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the uses of sampling. Okay, so sampling may be used by the auditor in, actually we have mentioned some of this in the previous video lectures that we have under this module. Okay, so again, sampling may be used for the test of controls. So in this case, sampling is used to direct towards the design or operation of a control to assess its effectiveness in preventing, detecting, and correcting material misstatements in the FS assertion. So in this case, sampling will help the auditor in assessing the operating effectiveness of the internal control of the entity. Okay, so sampling may also be used for substantive procedure. So for this case, sampling is used to obtain evidence about the validity and propriety of the accounting treatment of the transaction and balances. Okay, so again, samples are taken and evaluated, and then the result will be used to infer, okay, this result also to the population, because again, as mentioned earlier, samples are normally representative of the population if only selecting samples are determined appropriately by the auditor. Okay, so another, sampling may also be used for dual purpose tests. So under this one, sampling is used to test a control and also serve as a substantive procedure, okay, of a recorded balance or class of transaction. So when a dual purpose test is used, auditors will select the sample size as the higher of that required for the two purposes, so as to compensate for these two different tests. Okay, so that is the purpose. So we also have the different types of sampling plan. Okay, so in this case, the auditor can have the attribute sampling. So in this type of sampling plan, this is a statistical approach used with the test of controls. When we say attributes, this refers to the quality or characteristics. Okay, so in testing for attributes, the auditor will typically be concerned with the qualitative characteristics of the population. So this is used to estimate the proportion of deviations that is associated with particular set of controls. Since in this case, the subject matter is internal control, so the auditor will direct also on the qualitative characteristics of such. So he will use this attribute sampling plan. For example, purchase orders needs to be authorized. So attribute sampling is used to estimate the proportion of times or percentage that such documents have not been authorized, meaning to determine any deviations from such. Okay, so based on the deviation or occurrence rate computed in the sample, the auditor will then evaluate the control risk. Okay, and this can be assessed at below the maximum level. Okay, or depending on the result of the evaluation. So attribute sampling, or in attribute sampling, we have the different steps involved. Okay, first, the auditor should determine the objective why he will do such a test. Okay, so of course, in doing the test of controls, this is designed to provide reasonable assurance that the internal control is operating effectively. So attribute sampling is used when there is a trail or documentary evidence. If there is none, then this will not be possible. Second step is to define the attribute and deviation condition. So in this case, the auditor should identify the characteristics or attributes that would indicate operation of the internal controls. Okay, so what are those qualitative characteristics that should be determined? So the auditor then will define the possible deviation conditions, okay, to detect misstatement or to prove if indeed internal controls are reliable or not. Another step is define the same also. So in continuation, for instance, a control requires that each check be signed by the treasurer before it will be given to the payee. Hence, an issued check that was not signed or signed by another employee as other than the treasurer, this will be considered as a deviation. So next step is to define the population. So for test of controls, the population normally is based on the class of transactions being tested. Conclusions will then be based on the sample results and can only be projected to the population from which the sample was selected. So for those items which are different and not part of the population, so it will also be subjected to another evaluation. Okay, so it is important for the auditor to ensure that the population is appropriate to the objective. Okay, and the direction of testing must be considered at the same time so that the result of the sample will be inferred properly or appropriately to that population. Okay, for example, if the auditor's objective is to test for overstatement of accounts payable, so the population, of course, should be accounts payable listing and should not include any other transactions not part of the payable. Okay. So conversely, when testing for understatement of accounts payable, so the population should be subsequent disbursement, unpaid invoices, or unmatched receiving reports. Okay, because in this case, the entity might have not included such transactions in their records. So this will result into the understatement of the payables. Okay, so for completeness assertion, for example, if the auditor intends to select payment vouchers from a file, so conclusions cannot be drawn about all vouchers for the period unless the auditor is satisfied that all vouchers have in fact been filed. So this is how to consider or to ensure that the population is properly determined or defined. Okay, so the next step is determining the method for selecting the sample. So the most common is random sampling and systematic system sampling. Okay, next, after determining the method, so the auditor should also determine the sample size. So how many items should be included for evaluation. So determining the appropriate sample size is very important. If sample items chosen to be tested are less or very few in relation to the entire population, so there is a high probability that deviations in the client system of internal control will not be detected because there is lesser items that was included in the sample, so it will not represent the population. Okay, so deviations may not be present in the fewer samples but rather in other units which were not included in the sample. So that's a risk on the part of sampling risk, okay, on the part of the auditor. Okay, if the sample size will be increased, the risk that an existing deviation will not be discovered during the test control is decreased. Of course, as the auditor increases his sample size, the risk also will be minimized because as much as possible, he will evaluate more items. Okay, so the next step is performing the sampling plan. So the auditor should apply appropriate audit procedures to all items in the sample. So the purpose of this is to determine if there are any deviations from the prescribed control procedures. And also this is for the purpose of determining whether the internal controls are operating effectively or not. Okay, another step is evaluating the sample results. Okay, after identifying the number of items or the items to be included in the sample, so it will be evaluated. So the result, in this case, the auditor should interpret these results carefully and make conclusions with respect to the population from which these samples are taken, in which, if indeed these results can be inferred into the whole or the entire population. Next step is the auditor should document the sampling procedures that he performed. Okay, if each of the prior steps and the conclusions as well that the auditor reached should be documented in his working paper for reference and also to support his opinion later on. Okay, the second type of sampling plan is variable sampling. Okay, so in this type of audit or sampling plan, this is a form of sampling used to provide numerical estimate. So in this case, variables, the auditor will focus on the peso amounts or in terms of the number of units of the population. Whereas in the attribute sampling, he is concerned about the qualitative characteristics of the item. So normally, this is to determine whether the account balance is fairly stated. And variable estimation sampling is used by the auditor when performing, of course, the substantive test, because in this case, he will be concerned about the amount. Okay, so those are for the different uses of